Yeah.
Yes.
Good morning. Um, Barbara has completed her lesson, and apparently there aren't any questions in reference to that or anything for that matter. So I want to raise something here. We have talked about Abraham extensively, and in talking about Abraham, we've said constantly that Abraham and Sarah, the whole story about them is an allegory that's also filled with metaphors. And I do believe that a clearer example of that can be seen when we speak about Moses. Most of us have heard, all of us, I suppose, have heard about Moses and his experience with the burning bush. But that's not where I want to go right now. When Moses first left Egypt, he went to a place called Midian. And it is my understanding, and correct me if I'm missing it, that Midian is a city that was established by one of the sons of Ishmael. And I found something quite interesting there. When I looked at the story of Moses and him going to Midian to the priest, let me back up. When Moses got to Midian, he saw these young ladies at the well watering the sheep. And it was 7 daughters of the priests of Midian. Shepherds forced them away from the trough, and Moses stood up for them and helped them water the sheep. They go back to their daddy and tell him what happened in response to a question he raised. How did you get back so quickly? And they told him that this Egyptian helped them. And he asked them, why did they not bring him home? First question, why would they refer to Moses as an Egyptian? What made them think that Moses was an Egyptian? Any thoughts about that? What made them think that Moses was an Egyptian?
Pastor, just a correction. Midian was the son of Keturah, who was Abraham's
yeah, okay.
wife.
I'm sorry. Yeah, Keturah. Thank you.
Yes. Moses personified everything about the Egyptians. He dressed like them. He talked like them. He was perceived by them as one of them in terms of the authority that he had. So.
Well, and Moses was a prince of Egypt, so he would have had a certain bearing, a certain carriage about the way he carried himself. He would have spoke a certain way that was characteristic of a prince of Egypt.
Okay. So Moses looked like an Egyptian. And offspring of Jacob's sons were in Egypt. So why is it that the priest of Midian would accept an Egyptian into his midst? I think this line of thought is worth pursuing. Why? Because when we look at it, we see there are 7 daughters, and when Moses goes to when they come back to get Moses, carry Moses to their father's house, and the father's name, or the priest's name, is Jethro. And what Jethro does is give Moses Zipporah. And, of course, they had 2 sons. And that's not what I want to look at right now. When he gave his daughter Zipporah to Moses, they went on to talk about, it goes on to talk about that God looked upon the children of Israel because they were crying out. And this is all the chapter of Exodus. And it says that God heard the cries of Israel. And when it says that, it says also that God sends Moses back to Israel. To Egypt. Now, Zipporah's name means bird, or it speaks of a little bird fluttering. It also means to be dubious or to return. Moses' name means to pull out. The literal meaning is to pull out. See here is Jethro is the priest, but we see in the next chapter that the priest Jethro's name becomes Ruel, which means, in the next few verses rather, we see Jethro's name become Ruel in that 18th verse. And so what I'm saying is this has to be a story about how the children, the offspring of Keturah, aided the offspring of Sarah. Why do I say this? Because of Midian. Jethro lived in Midian. And Jethro living in Midian means that he was an offspring of Keturah. This is what stood out to me more than anything else. I don't see where Keturah's offspring went into slavery to Egypt or to any place else. However, I do see that the offspring of Sarah did go into Egypt, enslaved in Egypt. Why is that so? Could it be Could it be that the son of Keturah were priests? And the reason we don't hear much of them is because the silence is sending a message. The silence is speaking to the reality of Keturah's offspring being spiritual. And that which is spiritual does its work, but is not necessarily seen in the physical world. If this is true, then it tells that the priest to Israel in the beginning was Jethro. Now later, I think in verse 18 of that second chapter, the name is called Ruel, referencing the same person. Ruel means, what is Ruel? It's slipping my mind right now. Ruel means friend of God. That's what it means. So, with the name changing so closely together, then would it be because it's speaking to a what? It's speaking to where what's taking place at that moment. Because right after that, we go into God hearing the cries of Israel, and then we go to Israel, and what do we find? We find that Moses goes back to Egypt to lead Israel out of Egypt. And when he does that, Jethro, along with Zipporah, comes to Moses with his children. Now, the scripture says that Moses led Israel out of Egypt. If Moses led Israel out of Egypt, then it's impossible for Israel to be a geographical location. Every single time we speak of Israel, we are talking about a group of people. Also, what I see there is when Moses led them out of Egypt, when Jethro got to Moses, Jethro watched what Moses was doing. And he said to Moses, you will wear yourself out judging people from morning to evening. You should find men who believe God and is truthful, and place them over thousands, over hundreds, over 50s, and then over 10s. And let them judge the people and the major things they bring to you. Moses acquiesced to that. So Moses not only respected that hold on a second, please. He recognized that Jethro was the priest. He accepted that. There is no mention of any priest coming out of Egypt. As a matter of fact, the priesthood of the descendants of Jacob was established after they came out of Egypt. Yet, the offspring of Keturah were already priests. So, is this telling us that the spiritual essence of our existence is shown to us through Keturah's children as opposed to those of Jacob? Is this telling us that we have been seeking the wrong energy in order for us to get through this wilderness experience? Is this telling us that we have been looking at the wrong source? If we are to get out of Egypt, out of this wilderness, then we must understand the correct lineage, so that we can embrace the correct essence of as to who we are and how we are to get out of this dilemma. Am I making sense so far? Because I feel like I'm rambling.
I think you are. Hello?
Go ahead.
Hello? I think you are. It's just new information. We're so used to going through the lineage of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. You know, and and now Jethro was an acquaintance, a father-in-law of Moses, a man on the side, if you will, of that lineage. And so, I believe you're really onto something, because understanding the lineage helps you trace back to the source, in a sense. But it's also potentially confusing if in fact we're tied so into Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob that we can't see beyond that lineage.
Right.
And Pastor, I see something too, but I don't know how to explain it or where to go with it. It also, to me, speaks of inclusion. You almost like no one left behind. All of this is a part of you, and part of your confusion is you have not seen the wholeness of who you are. So what you're digging up, or what you're showing us, is the other part of us, or the other part of what needs to be seen to get out of the wilderness. Does that make sense at all? It's almost like we've been taught to separate. We look at all the characters in the Bible, and we separate who and what we think is good and bad, and the rest we haven't paid a lot of attention to. But
right.
All of it is who you are. All of it is to be shared. All of it is what leads you in the direction you need to go in. That there is no separation. There's nothing that you can exclude.
Or is it also like a country that has like a modern day country, if you will, that has descendants from two different peoples, and in one half of the country, the language is one thing, and in another half of the country, the language is something else. Well, if you don't know the language and you're seeking to go someplace and you don't know the language of the other country, but it's also trying to show you that place that you want to go, you don't necessarily trust it because it's not what's in your limited sphere of knowledge of where you need to go. I don't know how else to explain it. It's like it's all pointing to the same source, but you don't understand the language.
Okay. Anyone else?
It also.
Go ahead, Ron.
I'm sorry. It also speaks to the polar sides of Abraham, because all of this is part of his seed as well. So he represents far more and a far greater spiritual realm than we have been led to believe. And that goes into some of Barbara's teaching as well. But it speaks volumes more as to understanding the principle or the concept of what Abraham represents. And I guess, yeah.
Then Abraham becomes, when we understand it correctly, Abraham becomes the father of all spiritual nations. Can you see that?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. So Abraham is the father of nations, but Abraham also was a friend of God. Abraham was also a righteous man. So the seed of righteousness is the seed from which all spirituality has grown in terms of how mankind seeks the truth or seeks its creator. Does that make sense?
Yes.
So, if that is the case, then what we are seeing is that the sin Jacob had to be carried into Egypt, and the descendants of Keturah did not go into Egypt. As a result of them having gone into Egypt, they appeared to be exactly what was said of Ishmael. He would be as a wild ass, a wild donkey. Israel became that. And they went into the wilderness, Egypt, came into the wilderness. While they are in the wilderness, what happened? The descendant of Keturah guides them through the wilderness. And there is no mention of any of Keturah's offspring having to go through a wilderness experience for something to be drawn out of them. Moses in the wilderness pulled out of Israel those things that were adverse to them recognizing their righteousness. So if we look at this spiritually, there will be those who have to go through the wilderness in order for them to become more accepting of those spiritual principles that are being offered. And even doing that, many of them will not accept it, and they will die in their wilderness. They will be part of the walking dead. They will be caught up in Egypt in their mindset, and as a result of that, they will remain in their wilderness experience. Does that make sense? Or would you have enough words about that? So, what are we saying? What are we saying here? We are saying if we follow the spiritual essence of who we were created to be, we don't have to go through a wilderness. There are those who do not have to go through a wilderness. It is the stubbornness that takes us through the wilderness. It is the weakness that takes us through the wilderness. And the weakness is shown when you see the truth and you choose to remain in the midst of religion, you are going through wilderness experiences like no other. However, when you see the truth and you embrace it and you seek to understand not just the truth you see at that moment, but the continuous truth, you don't have to go through that wilderness. Please, would you check your phones and make sure? Would you check your phone, make sure they're muted? Thank you. So what we're saying here is righteousness brought us to a fork in the road, and that's the same fork in the road that the masculinity was speaking of when it gave the name to femininity, saying that it is the fork in the road, meaning that it can birth one way or the other in terms of belief. So righteousness is the present, and those who are seeking righteousness will follow religion and get stuck in the wilderness, or they will seek to come out of the wilderness seeking righteousness. Yet, there are those who never have gone through the wilderness. I wonder who they are. Could it possibly be that those who came before us, those who came before enslavement, those who were present in the 4th century, did they have to have a wilderness experience in order to understand who they are? I think not. Why? Because everything that I have read, everything I've seen, written by Africans and written by Caucasians, written by all people, that anthropologists across the board, every one of them talks about how spiritual humanity was before it was invaded. And prior to this invasion, the the experiences were the same as were the experiences of Keturah's offspring. Spiritual, from birth to death. When the invasion took place, we see Abraham. We see Abraham pointing us to a way out of it, a way out of the religious antics that we are caught up in, a way out of what came with the invasion. And there are those who have taken that road that leads out of that place in the wilderness. So today, we are, even though we are descendants of those who were never in the wilderness, we are also descendants of those who had to have wilderness experiences. Now, in our present day, we are beginning to experience what took place before the invasion. And in experiencing what took place before the invasion, what we are seeing is that we are to pull out of the invaders all of those things that blind them to the reality of them having divinity, or them being created with divinity like everyone else was.
Question.
Uh-huh.
Can you clarify what you mean by invasion?
What I mean by invasion is when the Euro-Asians invaded Egypt, when the Romans invaded, when anything, any group of people who were not of African lineage invaded the kingdoms in Africa, inclusive of Egypt. That's what I mean.
Okay, thanks.
So it is incumbent upon us who recognize, first of all, that Israel are a group of people who will rule as Elohim. It is not a landmass. When we accept that, and then we also accept the reality that race does not play a role in what we must do. And that means we are to pull out or to draw out of the invaders, as well as some of us, the reality, their reality rather, of superiority. Now, this is my contention with this. When we are able to draw this out of the invaders, it will also be drawn out of those who have become inferior to the invaders. By choice. Why? Because the root of their beliefs comes from the invaders who took spirituality and made it something that was advantageous to them, and then sold it or forced it on others. So it is incumbent upon us to be the one who teaches, the one who draws out of them the lies that have been told, the bondage that has been that people have been placed in because of what they taught, and the bondage that we are currently in as a result of that. And why do I say once we do the invaders, we will be able, the others will be drawn out of it as well? Why? Because everything that the invaders have done, religious Africans, religious or Asians, religious Native Americans have followed suit with the invaders' principles of what spirituality is. And if they are the root of it, then once the root of it has been cast in the fire and burned, it's at that time that those of us who have chosen that route will begin to change. Does that make sense? Or do you have anything, any words about that, or any thoughts on that? Any thoughts on that?
Hey, Rep, this is Charles. Now, when the Caucasian invades and and they made us, they culture us into them. So how we gonna be able to understand who we are until we try to break that change of being ingrained in them? You understand what I'm trying to say?
I think I do.
Okay. Help me, man. Help me.
How are we going to be able to break that chain? First of all, as I said, when we recognize that we must go to the root of religion in order for us to cast that root into the burning fire so that others will walk away from it. When we recognize that, then we will begin to do it, and when we do it, that's when we begin to see the change. Can you see that, Charles?
Yes, sir. Because it's always a way out of anything. Because you're never stuck in it. You might be in it a while until you realize that you stuck in it. But being in places like what we're sitting in now is open us up so we can see that. So I understand it.
Okay, sir. Is there anyone else? Now, I don't mind.
Good morning, Pastor.
Uh-huh.
I'm sorry. Good morning, Pastor. This is Kathy. Quick question. So what you're saying is that, if I'm hearing you correctly, the tenements of religion remain the same, with the root of it being the same, having the same stronghold, simply because we have been trying to uproot from the wrong power source? Is that what you're saying?
Absolutely.
Okay. Can you talk a little more? Because I want to be clear, because I heard everything you said this morning, and I think I'm following you. But we have been looking in the wrong place to extract the power from the wrong place to uproot something. And therefore, it remains the same because we haven't been in the right place. So could you continue, say it a little more to bring a little more clarity to me?
Say that last part again, Kathy.
I said, could you talk about that a little bit more? And I know you will, to bring more clarity to me, because I think I'm seeing it, but I want to be clear.
Okay. Well, what I'm saying is that we are trying to bring our people, meaning bring the African, to a place of understanding who it is, because I'm talking conceptually, of course, then we are doing it in the wrong way, because it is so deeply, religion is so deeply ingrained in the African until it does not realize that the religion has become its master. And when we try to uproot that within the confines of the African, we will always fail. And the reason we will always fail is because we have not gone to the source of the problem. When we go to the source of the problem, that is the moment that we will begin to see change. Egypt is the source of the problem. The wilderness is where the problem is solved. You can die in the wilderness by rejecting everything that's been shown to you, and I'm going back in a minute, Kathy. Or you can die in the wilderness by allowing all of those principles that you have been inundated with to die, to fall away from you. Allow the Moses to pull them out so that you can become a Joshua, or so that you can become the one who is beyond the principles of Egypt. And now you are in a position to bring some type of resolution to the isms that we face today. And what I'm saying in essence is this. If the African does not teach the Caucasian, then the African at large will never change. Because whether we want to admit it or not, religion and government are the same. If we go to the government, we have not gone to the root, because religion is the root of the government. If we go to every African community and teach what we know the truth to be, it does no good. Why? Because even though we don't want to admit it, religion is still teaching that the Caucasian, the enslaver, is superior. And we still are buying into that in very subtle ways. Our lip service doesn't, but our actions do. When the Caucasian built Sunday school classrooms, Africans built Sunday school classrooms. When the Caucasian built family life centers, Africans did the same thing. Gyms, same thing. Bought vans, same thing. Only bring their people to church, same thing. We used to bring people. We used to pick people up. Community experiences. But that happens no more. We might not want to admit it, but change will not come until the root of the issues are dealt with. Does that help you, Kathy? If not, please ask.
Absolutely. Oh, no, that cleared it up. Thank you. That makes so much sense. Thank you.
You're welcome. Anyone else? So all we have seen is this. We have seen righteousness present itself to humanity. And humanity has chosen to take righteousness and make its own understandings of it. And some of us have taken righteousness and sought to follow it to the land of truth. And in doing so, when we entered the wilderness, the land of truth, we began to realize that we were experiencing the Moses effect. And the Moses effect is when everything is pulled out. When the Moses effect is when you get to the place where you understand that there is nothing to go back to. When you understand that everything that you have thought was real to you is no longer so. Does that make sense?
Yes.
So this is what I'm presenting today.
Pastor,
There are
I'm
those
sorry.
of us. Huh? Go ahead, Barbara.
Pastor, can I just inject something? Moses was a descendant of the Levites through Jacob, Israel.
Yes.
And his father-in-law then, whose name was Ruel, means friend of God, but who was also called Jethro, means his excellence or abundance. It's about abundance. And if you remember, Jethro had the 7 daughters. Most of the genealogy talks about the sons, but Jethro had the 7 daughters, and so it was like a combination, not a combination, a blend of the priesthood, priestly parts of the Levites on the one hand through Moses, and the priestly parts of Zipporah's folk through her daughter. The priestly parts of Zipporah through her mother Keturah. If you look at the story, just the story, but underneath the story, it has to do with the abundance of the priesthood, the priestly parts of who we are, and the need for the Shekinah to be blended in that. I don't quite know how to say it, but just looking at what daughters mean and the fact that Jethro had 7 of them, I don't quite know how to put it in words. It just stood out to me somehow.
Then Jethro had 7 of them. 7 speaks to completeness, doesn't it? So Jethro had the complete understanding of what was supposed to be done in the wilderness, and how to function in the wilderness without wearing yourself out before you completed the task of transformation.
I think it's
So it's
interesting.
like you're talking about abundance of wisdom and abundance of whatever.
Yes.
I think it's interesting too that We don't get any kind of story of Moses having to go through shenanigans to get this daughter. The priest just understands who he is and then presents his daughter to him as his wife. He didn't have to work for him or whatever, like Isaac and all that. So I think that's interesting that he didn't have to go through that.
Indeed. Indeed it is. And not only that, the daughters were, Moses did not just meet Zipporah, he met all 7 daughters at the well. So Zipporah being given to him, as Audrey said, not having to work for her, speaks more to me of how we are what? Freely, how we can receive and embrace femininity for the purpose of birthing spirituality without any struggle to get it or to work for it.
Maybe, well, Audrey, it got me to thinking too, and I even go back to think about Jacob and Leah and Rachel. Maybe the feminine aspect of it is the recognition, as you're saying, of who you are, and maybe that was already obvious because of the journey that Moses had taken. If you look at Isaac, the journey is part of his understanding of Sarah, but not gaining all of the understanding or seeing completely the completeness of himself until he meets what that woman name, his wife, Rebecca. So, and the same with Jacob. I mean, it takes him longer to come into his recognition as to seeing what's in him. So when Moses makes his stand in Egypt and flees from that and comes to a place that he doesn't recognize, but it's no happenstance that he's there. So his journey is shorter because his stance had been made in Egypt as to at least maybe not understanding fully who he is, but understanding who and what he does not want to be, not wanting to be a part of that system or that concept of bondage, being religious bondage and how it treats other people. So maybe that's the lightness of his journey, as opposed to the others that we've mentioned.
And I wonder if. Go ahead. I'm sorry, Ron.
No, I'm just thinking out loud. Go ahead, Bob. I'm trying to pull it together, but go ahead.
I'm thinking out loud too, Ron. Pastor does that, son. I mean, he throws stuff out there and he just. I wonder though. He did not work. It didn't say he worked for Zipporah, like Jacob worked for his wives, but he did stay 40 years with. I believe he stayed 40 years with Jethro and his people, and 40 is it's a generation, and I'm wondering if part of what Moses was doing is reconnecting, in a sense, to uncovering that, as you said, that awareness of who he was during that period of time. He obviously learned some things from his father-in-law, because this was an Egyptian in culture, a Israelite in birth, in a sense. And from his father, he had to know beyond the shadow of a doubt. He heard the voice of God, who told him what to do. And this is a man who ruled as almost as Pharaoh ruled in Egypt on the one hand, but during this 40 years had to come into had to learn other things as well, so that he could spiritually, in spiritual completeness, in a sense, go back and use the powers of the Creator to free all of those people, all of the Israelites. So, anyway, I'm just thinking out loud too.
Yeah, but I think we're saying the same thing. What we're describing are journeys. They're spiritual journeys, and taking to an account is 40 years. This is a transformation. It is a maturation of being comfortable with who you are, and that was different than what we see with Jacob and even with Isaac. So the observation is I think is right or spot on. I think it speaks volumes that he does not have to, or it doesn't log anywhere that he had to do anything for her. But I think it's because he was probably, I want to say, more balanced or based on what he was to do, as opposed to the other two seeing who they were and what they had to do.
I think he was more balanced. He lived 40 years in Egypt and 40 years with Jethro's people, which were in a sense generations. So yeah.
I think I see something else. And when you said Israelite, that triggered something. The scripture says that the Lord God of the Hebrews hath met with us, and now let us go. In verse 13 it says, and when he went out the second day, behold, 2 men of the Hebrews, not Israel, the Hebrews. So, what is being said here? Hebrew is the river crossing. And Israel is the spiritual aspects of the river crossing. It wasn't so much it wasn't the Hebrews who brought out, when they came out of Egypt, it says Israel. Why does it say Israel? Because the river crossers, the Hebrews, those who cross the river, have a choice to make now, whether they're going to serve the God on this side of the river or the other side. What that means is this: whether they're going to follow what it takes to be Israel, or are they going to remain under the bondage of the religious antics that they have been taught, or the religious rituals that they have been taught? Does that make sense?
Yes.
So that, again, speaks to the reality that there is no such thing as a physical Israel, either geographically or in terms of people. It is a spiritual concept that gives opportunity to dominate the earth as we were told from the beginning. And it speaks to being halted between two opinions about which way you're going to go. What route are you going to choose? And all of this is tied up in the journey that Moses took. He took a journey that gave the Hebrews an opportunity to choose which God they were going to serve. And in doing so, things had to be drawn out of them. Unrighteous concepts had to be drawn out of them. Belief that has no merit had to be drawn out of them. Being greedy or being a backbiter had to be drawn out of them in order for them to become Israel. Does that make you understand what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So anyone who is halted between two opinions is a river crosser. And you have an opportunity to stay in the dungeon of religion or live in the castle of righteousness. Any thoughts about that?
Yeah. Good morning, Pastor. Good morning, everyone. This is George in Philly. With the priest Jethro, was there a relationship in terms of him knowing about the Israelites in terms of their tradition and history? And also, because of that, is this why he did not want to be engaged in terms of their, the religious aspects of living, and him just wanting to have that freedom to live as the priest that he was, and then at the same time, caring for the foundation of, his priesthood? I'm just trying to distinguish whether or not he knew that there was something that he did not want to just engage with them in terms of just accepting that way of our lifestyle. I don't know if that makes any resonate. I'm done. Hello?
Pastor, you on mute?
I sure was. Thank you. Jethro knew what was going on in Egypt. He was very much aware of that. And it is simply saying that wisdom always knows where you are, whether you are in bondage or not. In Egypt, Israel was not in Egypt. The Hebrews were in Egypt, and they were referenced as Israel coming out of Egypt. It is no different than saying, while you are in the midst of religion, you have a choice. You can stay in the midst of religion and be halted between two opinions, whether or not you're going to continue in religion or do the work that it takes to understand righteousness. If you choose to do the work that it takes to understand righteousness, you're in the wilderness. And it's that wilderness experience that draws out of you all the religious things that were put in you. if you choose to stay in Israel, stay in Egypt, or to want to go back to Egypt, go back to religion while you're in that wilderness, then you die in the wilderness. While you are in that wilderness, you are experiencing the same things in your wilderness that Jesus experienced when he was in the wilderness for 40 days. Does that make sense, George?
Yes, it does. And, and I think Moses was, truly blessed to be able to experience both aspects of, again, Egypt, and also in terms of his time with Jethro. So I'm sure he saw both sides of the fence.
And you are blessed, we are blessed to have the same experience. Because when we were steeped in religion, it is no different than what was happening in Egypt. This idea of Egypt is a spiritual thing. This is speaking of the spiritual struggles that you have in religion that you never get past. There's always a burden of money. There's always a burden of doing something and making it up as we go. There's always a burden of trying to believe whether God told somebody to do something or not because it doesn't make sense. That is no different than making bricks without straw. That speaks to the struggle that it takes to please religion, because no matter how much you go through to do it, you never get there. And a decision has to be made. Whether or not you're going to sit there under that burden, and all you hear is, ain't he all right? Or he got up early Sunday morning, now it's time for us to celebrate Easter. Or you're going to leave that place and embrace the reality of who you are. It should not take 40 years as it took the Hebrews in the wilderness. Jesus says it can take 40 days. And in taking those 40 days, that is a spiritual journey. In taking 40 years, that is a religious journey. So we are Moses drawn out, or we are not. When we talk about the Moses and Jethro experience, we are simply talking about that still small voice in us. Jethro is that still small voice in us, guiding us to a place of balance, a reality that is real as opposed to fictitious. When we hear the voice of Jethro, when we hear that still small voice, that is the catalyst that inspires us to move beyond religion. And if you can see the association or group of churches as a religious body, and if you can see that as a circle, and you see in your mind's eye people walking out of that circle, that is throwing off the principles of spiritual bondage. And walking into the unknown is walking into the wilderness, because you don't know what you are going to be met with. You don't know how you're going to get through the wilderness. You don't know where the water is. You don't know anything other than what I just left is not real. At that point, you begin having serendipitous experiences. And those experiences are when you pick up the scriptures and you look and read what you've been reading all your life, you see something different. Example, when you pick up the scripture and you read about John baptizing Jesus, in religion, it tells you you have to be baptized in the water to get to heaven. But when you look at it through spiritual eyes, what you see is baptism by water was for Jesus, and baptism by the Spirit is for those who came after Jesus. These are the serendipitous experiences that you have when you are in the wilderness. You begin to see that Mary of Magdala was Jesus' wife. These are the things you begin to see. And what all of that speaks to with Jesus especially is a restoration of femininity, a restoration of the energy that is necessary for birthing truth, righteousness, balance, and all of those things that we were created not only to seek but to be. Are there any questions about that or comments? Is there anyone who would like to speak to that?
Well, the only thing that came to my mind then, the being tied to both those worlds is necessary so that you can see how to lead others, because you understand their plight, you understand the journey that they're taking. So to go back and there are some who are in religion who are true to what they think they know and believe in, and someone has to go down or go back to get them. So that's part of the journey as well. You're absolutely right, where it is not necessary for all to go through the wilderness, but it is quite necessary for some of us to know that journey as well, is what I hear you saying.
Yes, sir. Anyone else?
Good morning, everyone. As a suggestion to you, in trying to break this spiritual bondness that some people may be up under, to include myself, I encourage you to read a pamphlet called Urban Development Goals and Projects, or Urban Development Projects and Goals. And it was a study that was done in 1945 under the Truman administration. And it talks about the role of the minister that comes out of seminary school. Religion to me is a racket. And the best thing that I got going on are the dialogue on Saturday, Sunday, and Monday. The arena that we're in, at least we can discuss things. But, in conclusion, like I say, Reverend Richard, is anyone familiar with that study called Urban Development? It's either Urban Development Goals and Projects or Urban Development Project and Goals. You familiar with it, Rev?
Yes. And that's what I was talking about. One of the things, anyway, it's included in that, I should say maybe, that government is not the problem. religion is the problem, because religion is what founded the government. Religion controls the government. Example. There were evangelicals who not only supported but attended January 6th at the Capitol, the insurrection. And none of them has truly spoken out against it. However, they have gone out of their way, speaking of evangelicals, to support Rittenhouse in killing 2 people and wounding 1. So, quite frankly, to speak blatantly about America, Christianity is the problem in this country. Because Christianity has nothing, does not recognize, rather, us as a people. Let me show you what I'm saying. Whenever there is a request for the talking heads to have a Christian on their program, they are going to get a Catholic or they're going to get a white pastor. You might see T.D. Jakes on a talk show, but he is saying nothing different than what the evangelicals are saying in relationship to Scriptures. So what I'm saying is this: the way the Scriptures are interpreted is racist, and if it's racist, then the religion that comes out of that interpretation is also racist. And everyone who teaches based upon those interpretations are also racist, whether they admit it or not. You cannot teach racist interpretations without being racist yourself. Because if you are teaching it and you don't believe it, then you are worse than the one who initiated it. Are there any thoughts on that? Well, let me ask it another way. Is that clear?
A little bit, Rev.
What I'm saying is this, Charles. If I look at the Scriptures and I use the Scriptures to be racist, and if I teach from those Scriptures that have been interpreted in a racist way, if I use that to teach, it doesn't matter whether I'm Caucasian or African. I'm teaching racism because it had its genesis in racism, those interpretations. Does that make sense, Charles?
Yes, sir. It did.
Okay, thank you. Anyone else? No questions? No comments?
Hey, Rev, if that person is using the Bible and being racism and putting someone and he putting you in bondage, ain't that the it's hard to okay.
If they are teaching it and putting you in bondage, they themselves are also in bondage. And it's not just racism, it's also misogyny. That if you take the Scriptures and you interpret them and teach them based on what you think the Scripture says when it comes to women, that is misogyny. That is, those are adverse actions taken towards women. That is the reason women are mistreated, because the mistreatment has its genesis, has its origin in religion. And I don't understand how anyone can read anything about Jesus and not see the restoration of femininity in Jesus' teaching. Which means that the purpose for searching the scriptures were not to find truth. The purpose for searching the scriptures were to find points that would justify what they are doing, be it racism, be it misogyny, abortion, anything else. Is that clear?
Oh, yes.
Okay.
Yes, Pastor Richard, in the scriptures, we hear, that saying, obey your slave masters. Would that be, again, another way to look at that in terms of how the scriptures were used for the purpose of racism?
Absolutely. And that is the reason that Paul is the darling of Christianity. The Catholics love from Paul. Baptists, Methodists, Presbyterians love Paul and have taught us to love Paul too. I have a tendency to follow what Barnabas said. Paul is an imposter. There are some things that Paul said that lines up with what Jesus taught. There are others that do not. Paul clearly told that he does whatever the people he's in the midst of do, which means that he says what it takes to please them. When in Rome, do as Romans, is what he said.
That's what I was just going to say, because and I see that in the evangelicals. As long as you can say you saved, quote unquote, you can do whatever you want to do. And it doesn't matter as long as you say you're saved and you're a Christian. It's just hypocritical.
Thank you. Anyone else?
Well, Rev, and this is a question to anyone, being that you brought it up. With Apostle Paul, Peter didn't deal with Apostle Paul too much. Do you have an interpretation on that, or
yes?
How do you look at that?
If you read carefully the scriptures, when Peter and Paul had that altercation, what you will see is that Peter basically told Paul, we don't need you following us. He basically told Paul, you are not teaching what Jesus taught. And that's when they went their separate ways. When they went their separate ways, who went with Paul? When they went their separate ways, Paul went to Rome. And while in Rome, Paul wrote letters to the Romans, and he wrote about his journeys. And in doing so, he wrote what was palatable to the people to whom he was writing. Paul said, if a woman wants to know, let her ask her husband. Suppose she doesn't have one. Paul said a woman should cover her head when coming into the synagogue. Why is it that Jesus didn't say that? So, I deal with Paul based upon whether or not what Paul is saying lines up with the teachings of Jesus. There are some of the things that Paul writes about that does line up, but the overwhelming majority of things do not line up. And the reason evangelicals embrace Paul and hold to him so strongly is because anything they want to justify, they can find it in the writings of Paul. And the African church, the African Christian church, more specifically, has valued Paul above any other of the apostles. And that means that the African church is a party to the bondage of the African.
We can't forget, too, that Paul was a Roman citizen. So
right.
In going to Rome, he was trying to exercise his political clout, too, I believe. So he could have influence over those people in Judea.
Well, yeah, if you read it carefully, you're right. That's what it says. But in the end, what happened? The very people who he was trying to man please are the ones who killed him. Think about it. So what does that say to us? You can try to play both sides, but the most vicious side is the one that's going to get you eventually. And that's what happened to Paul. Does that help you, George?
If you're talking to me, Rev, I say yes.
George Watson, yes. Okay, good. Anyone else?
I have a question.
Go ahead. I just hear in your background.
I'm sorry, Linda and I are in the same room when I took my off earbuds. So based on what you said about Paul and the teachings and how it's being embraced by evangelicals,
I can't understand. Hello? Hello? You're in and out. I can't understand you.
Because it's not what it appears to be. Is that how we're supposed to interpret this now?
I did not hear could not understand, rather, the first part of what you were saying. It wasn't clear.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, go ahead.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, yeah, I can.
Okay, I said, based on what you just said, so when we begin to look at the evangelicals and the apostles and how they embrace certain teachings, are those things becoming guideposts to us that if they are embracing it and loving it, that's a point that we need to look at closer to find the truth of what it really means, because chances are it's a misinterpretation there, and we need to dig deeper to see the real spiritual meaning behind it, as opposed to just embracing these people like Apostle Paul or the teachings of these people just at face value. I'm beginning to feel that when we see the evangelicals rallying behind someone and saying we love that teaching, that to me now is a red flag that maybe that's where I need to look deeper to see what the real meaning is there, and to get a better understanding of what was being said, and to look at the person that was saying it much closer than just taking it at face value.
You're right. And that's what we've been doing. Because everything that we taught in Sunday school, everything that we preached from the pulpit was based upon evangelical teachings and interpretation. And what got us to where we are now, we start looking closer at what was actually being said or being written. And that is the reason that I said to you, not you, Kath, but you all, I ask you to follow me as I follow God, because the things that I have been teaching you is wrong. And I want to right those wrongs. And I promise you, I'll never teach you anything that is not in the Scriptures. Remember that?
Yes.
And that all that was said because there was a recognition that all this stuff is wrong, and we need to start seeing it again for the first time. It is very necessary, and that's what we make every effort to do on Saturday, Sunday, and Monday. We make every effort to clarify what is actually saying, as opposed to what we have been told that it's saying. And that is the major reason that we need each other when we are teaching, because we see different aspects of it and can raise questions that leads us to a deeper truth of understanding. Does that help you, dear?
Yes, thank you.
You're quite welcome. Anyone else?
Well, Rev, one of the things I'll say, and it's my belief, we really do need to examine Apostle Paul's writings, because I feel that his writings are designed to turn a Native American into an American Indian, turn an African into an African American. And once we get that American in our nationality, we're somewhat, we fail for the Good Samaritan or the pigeon drop or a con game. We really do need to examine his writings and talk about them, question them. Women shouldn't speak in the church. They speak every place else. Why they can't speak in the church? And those kind of things, as it relates to masculine energy and feminine energy, we really get a distort of a misrepresentation of masculine energy, and we also get a misrepresentation of feminine energy. Like that's just my opinion. But I do think we need to examine his writing, word for word, line for line.
Well, George, we have examined his writing.
And you have.
And that's
and forgive me, and Reb, I wasn't saying we hadn't examined his writing.
No. I want to finish. We have examined his writings, and that is the reason we very rarely reference Paul. And when we do, it's because it's something that's in line with what Jesus said, or it's to show us the errors of the Christian way. So we have examined those, and we have examined them based upon what the other apostles had to say about him. not just Barnabas, but Thomas also. So we've done that, and continue to do. A matter of fact, right now, I think it's more important for us to teach the concepts of what's in the Scripture, and that's what we've been doing with Abraham and Moses today, and with Jesus being brought in terms of what he taught to undergird what we are saying. Also, I do not see anyone who has delved deep enough into the writings in the Old Testament to see what we are seeing in relationship to these characters being concepts as opposed to names of people. And as I said earlier, I think that is more evident with the priest of Midian, who's called Jethro and then called Ruel. So one is abundance, and as Barbara said, I think she has an abundance of wisdom, and Ruel is a friend of God. So I think that we are beginning to see with a greater clarity and a more discerning eye what the concepts in the Scriptures are actually revealing to us about who we are now and who we have always been, and what direction we should take in order to be what we were created to be. Did that help you, George?
Yes, sir.
Okay, thank you. Are there any other questions or comments before I have something to say at the end?
I have one, Reb.
Uh-huh.
You remember when you said the Hebrew was the river crossers, and Israel is who I say think like God or does rule like God. Okay, how do the Jews come in the picture? Because you remember when Jesus was on the cross, he put on the cross, they put,
Let's stop right here.
All right.
There is no such thing as a Jew. The word Jew in the Scripture should never have been there. There is no such thing as a religion called Judaism. This speaks, everywhere you see Jew, it should be Judah. Jew is a made-up name. And we may use it without thinking, but that never should have been there. There is no such thing as a Jew. There is, if you look at what Christian means, there are no Christians. So what am I saying? Before you label yourself as being something, you need to investigate that label and see what it's actually saying and see if that's who you really are. The consistency of what Christian means and how it is used is not there. It is as different as day and night. Okay?
Got you.
Anyone else? Okay. No questions, no comments. Let me say this. The last time that I checked the infection rate. Remember, you can stop recording if you want to. The last time I checked, I think it was 4.7.